Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're based. I hope that you're all keeping well. And first of all, we want to thank you for attending this webinar with us. As we start, I think the chat is available, and I'm going to ask everyone to please be grounded here. And I'm going to ask you, as you're coming in, to put in the name of a caregiver. So either your parent or another caregiver that's been important in your life. And I'll just take a couple of minutes for you to please put that name into the chat. So either your mother, your father, your grandparent, an uncle, somebody that's been important in terms of caregiving in your life. All right, I'm not seeing the chats, but hopefully they are coming in. And we're going to start because we have a busy session today. So my name is Sabine Rakotomalala, and I work for the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. And today I'm not here representing the World Health Organization, but I'm representing the Global Initiative to Support Parents, which was set up in 2019. So this webinar is being organized by the Global Parenting Initiative, which is led by Parenting for Lifelong Health, alongside the Global Initiative to Support Parents, which is a universal movement bringing together a lot of organizations, all of organizations really working on parenting in an effort to call for universal parenting support around the world. So today I'm representing the Global Initiative to Support Parents. Just a couple of house rules before we begin. So because this presentation is in webinar format, you will not be able to unmute yourself or turn your camera on. You will see that we have a Q&A session later. We hope that the presentations will go quite quickly so that we have a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. But in the meanwhile, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A box to leave any questions that you have for the speakers and the panelists. And if we don't get to your question, we will respond through the GPI website later. So rest assured that you will get responses to your question. Next slide, please. So today is really a special day, actually, because it's World Refugee Day, and it's also Parenting Month. So we didn't choose this day by coincidence. It was really because the 1st of June is Parenting Day, and then the whole of the month of June is Parenting Month. And on top of it, today's World Refugee Day. And we realize that parenting is difficult for everyone. Parenting is important for everyone, but even more so in humanitarian contexts, whether they're linked to climate change, natural disasters, or conflict affected areas. Two other points that I'd like to make before handing over to my next speaker is that very recently WHO launched a systematic review on what works, their guidelines on parenting interventions to prevent maltreatment and enhance parent-child relationships for children aged 0 to 17 years old. And these guidelines were the effort of about 2 years of work of a systematic review of the evidence, and they provide evidence-based recommendations on parenting interventions. So I will pop that tool into the chat right now for people to look into. The second tool is another important one that was launched just last week, which is the Compendium of Resources for Family and Caregiving Strengthening in Humanitarian Settings. So the Family Strengthening Task Force of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action developed this tool over about a 2-year period, and it's a compendium of training materials, guidelines, intervention handbooks, and campaigns, about 52 of them, if I'm not mistaken, that exist really to support parenting interventions in humanitarian settings. So today we have an hour session. After my short introduction, I'll hand over to Dr. Isang from Parenting for Lifelong Health. Then Mary Ullman will also be speaking on behalf of the Global Initiative to Support Parenting. Then we'll have Kaomi, who will be presenting on the mental health psychosocial support package. And I know I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I'm just forgetting what the correct spelling is. So from UNICEF, we'll be presenting the mental health psychosocial support package. And then we'll have a panel with 4 panelists, Dr. Ala from UNODC, Yvonne from International Rescue Committee, Kayam Hussein from Karachi Relief Trust, and then Anthony Guevara from War Child Holland. And the closing will be done by Rebecca from Save the Children. And without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Isang.
Thank you, Sabine. I hope everyone can hear me. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this webinar. I'm Isang Awa, Head of Advocacy at the Global Parenting Initiative, Department of Social Policy and Intervention, University of Oxford. Together with Mary Ullman, who's from the Global Initiative to Support Parents, I'll briefly share on the context and research on supporting parents in crisis and humanitarian contexts. The next slide, please. No, the next one. Thank you. About 1 billion children experience violence each year, and many more in families struggling with the challenges of parenting. Research indicates that 250 million, or 43% of children under 5 years old living in low and middle income countries are at risk of not achieving their developmental potential. The next slide, please. The consequences of adverse childhood experiences are many and include poor mental health, poor child development, school failure and school dropout, alcohol and drug use, youth violence and risky behaviors, poor maternal and child health, intergenerational transmission of violence, crime, and so on. These outcomes of poor parenting are hugely costly to multiple systems. But the good news is that there is much evidence and knowledge on how to improve parenting skills. The next slide, please. So there are many benefits to supporting parents, such as optimizing early childhood development, enhancing mothers' and children's mental health, and interrupting the cycle of violence and neglect. The next slide, please. And parents can be supported through parenting programs, which are structured interventions that help parents learn skills and improve parenting behaviors along several dimensions. These then produce positive child and adult outcomes. There's evidence that parenting programs are effective in reducing child behavior problems and child maltreatment and improving both caregiver and mental health and child mental health, amongst other outcomes. But I must point out that most of the studies were carried out in non-humanitarian settings. The next slide, please. Sadly, there has been an increase in incidents of natural disasters, health emergencies, and armed conflicts globally. Last year, the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide reached a record high 108.4 million. Globally, an estimated 268 million children and adolescents across 73 countries are affected by crises, and about 72 million children are out of school. These statistics and figures are parents, caregivers, and much loved children. Beyond affecting landscapes, crises affect families in unimaginable ways. The next slide, please. During humanitarian crisis, families experience and witness death, displacement, hardships, and financial stress, separation, and very often violence. All of this lead to an unprecedented level of stress for parents and caregivers. And alongside the increased stress, fear, and trauma, they have to look after their children round the clock. As can be expected, the exposure to trauma, hardships, and poor parental mental health usually lead to changes in parenting behaviors and increased harsh parenting and violence against children. The next slide, please. In addition to harsh parenting, millions of girls and boys are exposed to unthinkable forms of violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect during crisis. Some children are turned from their parents, trafficked, sexually abused, and in conflict may be recruited by armed forces, injured, and/or killed. Children also lose health, education, and protection services during crisis. All of these have huge adverse impact on their mental health, as well as consequences that can last a lifetime. The next slide, please. However, there are interventions for families in crisis settings. These interventions provide mental health and psychosocial support for parents and caregivers and skill them to improve parenting behaviors and also support their children to cope during crisis. Examples of such interventions are the Parenting in Crisis resources that the Parenting for Lifelong Health team, in collaboration with UN agencies and other organizations, have developed and disseminated during various crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. You can see other responses. There are other resources as well. The resources included tip sheets, social media squares, videos, etc., with parenting tips specific to the crisis context. The next slide, please. The next slide, please. Our partner organization in Ukraine, World Without Orphans, shared this feedback from a mother who used the Ukraine parenting resources. And I'll pause for a few seconds for you to read the feedback. The next slide. Although there are interventions for families, evidence from humanitarian settings is limited both in quantity and quality. This is partly because there are several challenges with conducting research in humanitarian contexts, such as traditional research designs not being feasible in humanitarian settings. But there are strategies that could be adopted to address these challenges. More than ever, we need to build a robust evidence base for interventions that can be delivered at scale during crisis. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to Marie.
Thank you, Sang. And good day to all. My name is Mari Ullman. I am the technical advisor for Parenting in Crisis, recently having joined the global initiative to support parents. I'm so happy to be here to be talking about this important topic. The global initiative to support parents has come together, and it's all the organizations that you see, the logos at the bottom of this slide, have come together to provide families around the world with the tools, knowledge, and support they need to nurture their children's development, cope with stress, improve parenting, and reduce violence in the home. And today we're talking about what that kind of support looks like. That's fine, thank you, in crisis contexts. In approaching the issue of parenting in crisis, the GISP is exploring these core questions with the community and with all of you, and some of them I'll share now. For instance, what are the needs of parents, caregivers, and children at different stage of a crisis and emergency? And this will vary depending on the type of crisis and the phase of the emergency. We've all heard of the very famous African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, what does that look like when the village has been wiped out or the community is scattered? How do you rebuild that village, and how do you cope with the changes that are happening, both with the parent as well as with the child, the different behaviors the child may be exhibiting as a result of the excessive stress or trauma? So how does the parent understand that these are normal responses to extraordinary circumstances? These are the kinds of supports that parents may need. And while some of the interventions that work in other contexts that are not emergency may be adjusted to apply, there will also be some differences in crisis contexts. For instance, there may be an elevated need for mental health and psychosocial support or trauma-informed practices. And I'm sure some of the speakers on our panel will speak to that later. And this is why it's really important to address all of those different needs and compounding risks, that policies, services, and programs are effective meeting this, and that there's consideration for how this can be delivered in crisis contexts, because some of the more intensive parenting sessions that may be effective elsewhere maybe are not feasible in crisis contexts. So the important thing is that we all work together across sectors, across organizations, to make a compelling case for parenting in crisis and to increase the provision and the funding for this work. And that's part of what the GISP is intending to do, to lay the foundation for increasing the uptake of parenting in crisis, and stimulating dialogue across sectors, enabling learning and exchange, such as this event today. And very soon, within about a week or so, we'll hear from the GISP on a new website where they'll be launching a global online platform that will bring together resources, information for stakeholders, and we look forward to that. In the interest of sharing across sectors, my work in parenting has come from the ECD and emergency sector, early childhood development. And some years back with the Moving Minds Alliance, we did an analysis that I thought would be relevant to this audience today. And it's an analysis at the time to get a sense of to what extent are the nurturing care domains represented in humanitarian and refugee action plans. We know that it's hard to get data on whether or not parenting is being delivered, and we know that this is not nearly enough. But we wanted to get a sense as we started the work with Moving Minds, what does it actually look like? What are we talking about? And so there was an analysis of the 26 active response plans back in 2018. This is pre-pandemic, I'd make a note. And we found that there was no mention of any component of interventions related to responsive caregiving or parenting in 11 out of the 26 response plans. And so only 10% mentioned any interventions to support parents and caregivers. So this is indicative of the work that we have to do that lays before us to increase this. And thinking about how this relates to the other domains and how we might integrate and work with each other to improve that. Next slide. And then I just wanted to end with this quote that I heard recently from a filmmaker who is a Syrian refugee and a mother and a parent, just to remind us as we start to break up categories and domains of need and development for children. It's important to remember that these are whole human beings and that we need to approach them that way. And I love this quote from the filmmaker Wad al-Khattab, who said, "It's about motherhood, it's about love, and it's about not giving up." And she's a mother, but also this would be the case for fathers and parents. We need to make sure that we can support them and make sure that they have the capacity and their own well-being is sufficient so that they can support and nurture their children. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Dr. Quiva Nickelvoord, hope I said that right, who will talk about UNICEF's approach to parenting in crisis. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Marie. So, as you probably know, UNICEF's primary mandate is to uphold the rights of children. But we know from many years of working in emergencies that you can't actually effectively look after children without also engaging and supporting the people who care for those children. And that means that as well as working directly with children, we always work closely with caregivers and other family members, as well as the wider community, so teachers, health workers, anyone interacting with children, and then at the government policy level. And we know that if we only look at one or two of these levels, our work is much less likely to be impactful and sustainable over the long run. So why is working with caregivers important? Well, we know that children who grow up in safe, loving, responsive caregiving environments tend to be more emotionally secure. They tend to have better social skills, and critically, they tend to be better able to cope with adversity. So this is obviously particularly important in an emergency context. When a humanitarian emergency hits, it brings extreme stress, it brings economic insecurity and complete social upheaval. So many caregivers and their children have to endure the sudden deaths of people that they love, often in very brutal ways. They have to endure separation from family members. Many might be injured, they might become homeless, they might experience poverty and hunger for the first time. And on top of all that, all of their usual support structures and networks are more often than not are completely disrupted. So this can severely undermine a caregiver's ability to look after themselves and their own well-being, but also their ability to support and provide nurturing care for their children. We know that without the right support, this can have a deep and long-term impact on the mental health and psychosocial well-being of caregivers and their children. But this not only affects them personally, but it also has implications for how well the whole community can actually recover and rebuild after an emergency. And so the good news is that even in times of extreme crisis, there are effective things we can do to help people to establish a sense of safety, to strengthen their social connections, to regain a sense of control, and to develop a sense of hope. And these are the factors really we're trying to address when we look at mental health and psychosocial support programming, because these factors are directly associated with positive well-being and recovery after a crisis. And we can also provide opportunities for caregivers to build skills in recognizing and responding to distress, both in themselves and also in children of different ages, because distress can look different in people of different ages, and how children respond in an emergency is not always the way people expect. So it's important that we deliver messages that normalize normal reactions to abnormal situations. And we're going to hear about some specific interventions from the panelists in a few moments, but I'd like to just mention a package that brings together lots of guidance and tools for supporting parents and caregivers in emergencies. So it's called the MHPSS Minimum Service Package. And basically it's a set of mental health and psychosocial support activities that are considered to be of the highest priority in meeting MHPSS needs in an emergency. And just to say, MHPSS stands for mental health and psychosocial support, if you're not familiar with that jargon. So this package is not only about children and caregivers, but it provides a framework for the whole response across all sectors, including people working in child protection, in health, in education, in services for gender-based violence survivors, shelter, and on and on. And the idea is that when an emergency happens, we don't need to start from scratch. We already have quite a lot of knowledge from many emergencies over many years about, that can help us to prioritize what to do. And this package has been published by the Global Interagency Standing Committee. And that means it's not just a product of one organization, but it's gone through extensive review and language has been carefully negotiated between different sectors and many organizations. And ultimately, it's been endorsed at a high level in the humanitarian response architecture. And what I wanted to point out about this is that out of 14 MHPSS activities that are included in this package, 14 programmatic activities, 4 of them have a particular focus on caregivers. And I think that really highlights that there's now broad recognition and understanding of the importance of working with caregivers when a crisis hits. So there's a dedicated activity on promoting caregivers' mental health and strengthening their capacity to support their children. There's also a section on early childhood development work that looks at promoting nurturing relationships between caregivers and young children. So as Marie mentioned, this is not something that has always been given the prominence that it needs and that it deserves, but I think it's a really good sign that it's literally prioritized as one of the non-negotiable priority MHPSS activities in this new interagency package. There's also a section on structured group activities for children that explicitly includes an action on caregiver engagement. And there's a section on disseminating key MHPSS messages, and that links to a bank of key messages specifically for caregivers. Each of those activities comes with a checklist of practical actions and a compilation of available guidelines and tools to support with planning and implementation. So the MSP kind of brings all these resources together, but it links to many other tools and curricula and resources that you can find freely available online to support with programming. So that has been that's just the slide showing the checklist and those resources. So that's been a quick tour of the overarching package of the MSP that you can use to find guidance on different relevant topics. And hopefully the panel discussion will bring some of this to life with concrete examples from real world emergencies. So I'll hand back now to our moderator for the panel session. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kiva. Hi, everyone. I'm Genevieve Halptrani. I'm the Community of Practice Lead. I'll ask our panelists to turn their cameras on now. And I will be moderating the session today, the panel discussion. And just to say, I have the privilege of welcoming our panelists, but also introducing them. So I'll do that quite briefly so we can get straight to the discussion. So our first panelist is Ivana Yengo, and who is a child protection senior research advisor at the International Rescue Committee. Then we have Dr. Ala Al-Khayani, who is the humanitarian psychologist working as a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We also have Anthony Govera, who is a researcher in the Research and Development Department at War Child Holland. And finally, we have Khayyam Hussain, who is the co-founder and trustee of the Karachi Relief Trust. So I'm welcoming them to this discussion today and to this panel. So for us to get started, I'd like the panelists to each provide some context of their work, and in doing this also highlight some of the challenges and successes of the experience, or what they've experienced. So I'm going to start off with Ala from UNODC, and you can start. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the previous speakers for their really important contributions. Though we know that children in humanitarian contexts can really be protected by warm, secure parenting. Yet until recently, caregiver support was only often ignored in the cycle of care that families are given in such contexts. So I'm going to take the example of our UNODC response to the ongoing Syrian conflict to illustrate how a multi-level model of family support can and should be mapped against any humanitarian response. So the first steps was a caregiver and family needs assessment. So myself and Professor Kalem at the University of Manchester conducted field research in refugee camps in Syria and in Turkey, really working on understanding what challenges families face in caring for their children. And we found that caregivers were really struggling as they watched their children change in their behaviors and in their emotions, while also themselves feeling a huge sense of anxiety, a lack of control, and trauma themselves, and not knowing where to get support from. So in response to this identified gap at UNODC, we've developed this multi-level parenting support model for families living in challenged humanitarian settings. And this really maps well against the MHPSS model of psychosocial support, where at every level, families can access support of different intensities. And I'm going to touch briefly on these stages to illustrate what tools are available at each stage and how we are using them both in Syria and globally. So from our research, we recognize that all families can benefit from parenting information. So the bottom level here is efforts to provide basic information at a very universal level. We started with developing a leaflet, and now we have this as a recorded video to increase accessibility and meet the needs of low literacy, sharing too on social media platforms and WhatsApp and on government and NGO websites. And we have a number of other tools that sit at this level. Many of them Dr. Isang just shared as interagency resources at this bottom level. As we go up to the next level of our model, and this takes us to areas where we have more resources and more stable environment. And here we've developed a light touch intervention that consists of parents receiving a parenting booklet to demonstrate key parenting information, as well as take part in a 2-hour conversation group. And we've developed and used a number of these booklets in Syria and globally, such as parenting during COVID, parenting during conflict and displacement, and so on, parenting during crisis. Next level up of our model sits the multi-session programs. So as we're going up the model, the programs are becoming more intensive. One challenge we really need to overcome first, before we can disseminate at this level, is we need to ensure that families will be remaining in one place for long enough for us to engage with them for the duration of the multi-session intervention. And one example of such a program is Strong Families, an evidence-based UNODC multi-session family skills prevention intervention that has the aim of improving child well-being and also family functioning and mental health. And a key feature of this program that has really ensured it to have been such a success globally is that it was designed for families living in challenged or humanitarian settings. So what does this mean? This means that it's brief, it's only 3 sessions, it's light, so it requires the infrastructure that's really easy to mobilize and train. And also the training is aimed at lay people from different backgrounds. And these are key considerations for humanitarian contexts. There's no royalty fees or costs, which really facilitates the engagement of government and field staff with the Strong Families intervention. And we have several publications if anyone wants to find out more. But back to our model, what about interventions for children who really need more specific tailored trauma recovery intervention due to trauma experiences? And one of the main benefits of utilizing this kind of stepped model approach is that it's a key way to identify who needs more support and who needs this more intensive trauma recovery work. So at the tip of our model in the lightest green sits the Children and War Foundation Trauma Recovery Program, teaching recovery techniques. And this is for children who score high on trauma measures. And by enhancing this existing program, by adding a whole stream of parenting sessions, so that while children take part in trauma recovery work, their parents also learn the same trauma recovery skills, as well as learn key parenting skills, has been shown to be really significantly improved child well-being and family functioning. And this is one of the drawings of the participating refugee children who was having intense nightmares before taking part in the program of planes being dropped in Syria, and after the intervention was able to imagine planes dropping gifts and not bombs, an image I always find particularly moving. So finally, this UNODC pyramid is one example of the ways that support can be conceptualized. And there are other programs and resources, of course, and these links will all be shared with all of us, I hope. And I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you. Chaim, over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, may I request that we take just a moment of silence for the tragedy last week in Mpondwe, Uganda, where so many innocent children had their lives taken away mercilessly. May all the victims rest in peace. So I want to start by saying that Karachi Relief Trust message is generally a message of hope and a message of joy. Our country has suffered greatly over the last 2 decades since the war on terror started. We've faced 2 super floods, we've had earthquakes, we've had our own refugee crisis, heat waves, and then most recently the pandemic before we got hit by the most recent super flood last year. Also that our organization, Karachi Relief Trust, is run almost entirely by volunteers. We only have 1 paid employee in the whole organization. And while we've been working in disasters since 2007, the real test of our capability and capacity, I would say, came when Pakistan was hit by the first super flood in 2010. It was the first time that we saw what climate change can do. We had intense monsoon rains attributed to La Nina phenomena, and about 20 million people were affected at the time. During that time, we had set up 50 camps for the refugees, and we hosted about 30,000 people. And eventually we ended up building 7,000 permanent homes in villages that were destroyed by the floods. So a lot of learning came during the time that we were hosting these families who were affected by the flood. And we realized that our forte is really to fill in the gaps during the disasters. Primarily, it was during the disasters, the filling in the gaps was medical aid, medical camps, provision of food aid, whether it's cooked or dry rations, hygiene kits, and also setting up safe places for children and especially for lactating women. Again, now 12 years later, last year, a more intense flood hit Pakistan. Widespread rains and another climate change phenomena with melting glaciers caused climate disaster of biblical proportions. 1/3 of our country was submerged in water, and that's why I have my background showing just one of the village, but pretty much a lot of the country was looking like that. More than 30 million people were affected, and people would call them climate refugees. And I saw personally myself some very touching scenes: widespread waterborne diseases, hunger, death, destruction. And during all this, the most vulnerable of the population was, of course, the children. We were working very closely with our partners, Indus Hospital, with the doctors there, who taught us the facts that, compared to adults, we don't realize this, but children suffer far more severe physical effects from disasters because they breathe more air per pound of their weight. They have thinner skin. They are at greater risks in cases of fluid losses and are more likely to lose body heat. But naturally, what we really saw was that the real damage is the trauma that they're living with. And seeing it firsthand literally shakes you up. You can see in their eyes the feeling of despair, losing interest in activities, and hopelessness written all over. And unlike, when we worked in the earthquake lasts for a few minutes, and the victims see the damage within a few minutes, it's over. But the flood actually continues to wreak havoc for weeks and weeks. So I just want to create that context that imagine the plight of a poor, impoverished child watching the flood destroy their safety net and then fall sick with no access to medical help, often eating 1 meal a day. I personally was approached by a child who said that when my mother puts me to bed early, I know that there's no dinner at home. So this kind of suffering is going on for days and weeks at end. And how do parents deal with such traumatized children? I mean, as the speakers before me mentioned, they too are suffering and have tremendous responsibility to rebuild their own lives and also to bring about some degree of normalcy. So we quickly realized that schools will be closed for an extended period of time. Schools were providing some routine to the children. So we basically studied the UNICEF concept of school in a box, and we tried to bring that initiative into the villages that we were working. And we did a prototype in northern Pakistan, one of the first villages that was completely destroyed by the flood, just to give the children some routine in the safe area, simple psychosocial activities, sports, games, activities that would keep the children engaged, that they can express their feelings, basically to help them cope. I don't know if many of you know, but in our part of the world, the sport cricket is played a lot and loved by all ages. And, we found that, it was a great way to move the traumatized children into team building exercise and basically to help them build resilience and get their mind off the trauma that they were facing day in and day out. Of course, another simple way is giving, within the school in the box, we were providing children with basic arts and crafts so they could draw and paint, which became quite a therapeutic outlet. They could express their emotions, and also the fear, which, I saw in Dr. Ala's slide, that how, very similar concepts we've also noticed, children universally speak the same language. It was quite obvious, Finally, we also had several sessions with another NGO called GoRead.pk, which is an amazing organization out of Pakistan. They hold they hold these read aloud sessions, story sessions, and they focus a lot on hand holding more than, the academic side of what we were doing in the school in the box. And all their stories had messages for children, basically messages that bring joy and learning. Just to answer the question that Jean, you had posed, that, how do we, what was the success? And, we could see the success. We saw the children and parents staying engaged, looking forward to their daily activities. Also, the intervention allowed KRT an opportunity to sow some seeds of change for the future. We saw that, when we are rebuilding their homes, we are engaged with them, we can actually have some leverage over the community. For example, asking the parents to make sure that the children go to school. And if you have limited resources, then at least the girl child should go to school, because the women basically in the rural areas basically are running, the household, and they are the ones who are interacting. So it's very important that women are empowered to take, become the future champions, if you will. And another big reason of success has, of course, been partnering with other organizations, like, we got the parenting tips from our friend Dr. Isang and her team, which, the intervention basically was encouraging a lot of community involvement and engagement. The good thing was these tips were translated in local language, so the dissemination became very easy. Also in the village that we were doing the prototyping, Brep, Chitral, the parents engaged very freely with the caregivers and volunteers, which created a community-like atmosphere. The parents, also supported the idea of children engaging in sports. Children enjoyed reading sessions. And in fact,
I'm going to have to stop you so that we can move on to the next panelist, but it's amazing to hear all of the positives that have come out of this. Yeah. So I'm going to hand it over to Anthony now to just give us some input as well. Thank you, Khayyam.
Thanks, everyone. So traditionally speaking, a lot of group interventions aimed at improving parenting have the kind of implicit assumption that suboptimal parenting is primarily explained by a lack of parenting skills and knowledge. And they kind of typically prioritize the acquisition of these skills and knowledge in their intervention design. However, by now we already have robust evidence that chronic adversity and war exposure in themselves can lead to compromised parenting. So when introducing the War Child developed parenting intervention, Be There, a caregiver support intervention, the intervention took this into account in its development. And it's, as such, it aims to improve parenting via two different pathways. The first one is indirectly by addressing specifically these aspects of psychosocial well-being, mental health of caregivers that we've already touched upon. So improving those, and secondly, directly by strengthening the parenting knowledge and skills of these caregivers of evidence-based parenting methods. And as such, it's a group intervention aimed at the primary caregivers of children aged 3 to 12 that are affected by conflict and adversity. And already in its intervention design and development, it takes this association between caregiver well-being and parenting, and then ultimately child well-being into account. Which is why of the 9 weekly sessions that constitute the intervention, sessions 1 and 4 focus specifically on caregiver well-being, and only after that sessions 5 to 8 focus on parenting skills and knowledge, and the final 9th session is a recap and closing session. And as such, it's a level 2 preventative intervention that's delivered by trained non-specialists in groups of ideally 10 to 12 caregivers, in sessions lasting up to 2 hours, which is combined with home practice of the techniques and skills that are introduced. When kind of talking about some of the successes and challenges that the intervention has faced, and both in its development and implementation, two kind of key takeaways that I thought of was, the first is the kind of extensive development process, which really made sure that the intervention and all its activities and language and everything that it includes are relevant for the context and population which it was being developed for at the time. In this process, it went through a multi-stage kind of iterative process for its development. So it was originally developed in Gaza, and then and further in Lebanon and Jordan. And throughout this process, after the first draft, which included input from local and international experts, 2 different practice runs were done with the intervention, with 72 families in each of the practice runs. First one in Gaza, the second one in Tripoli, Lebanon. And most of these practice runs were really followed by kind of very extensive focus group discussions and feedback sessions and revisions to kind of identify and get any kind of feedback that was coming from the families, but also then to actually address any of these issues with language, concepts, anything that wasn't translating from the experts to the families that were participating in the intervention. And the second point is the engagement of male caregivers, which is also a crucial aspect of parenting interventions. And initially in the first practice run, the engagement and attendance by male caregivers was a lot lower, but then by female caregivers. And then throughout this feedback process, through these focus group discussions, we're able to identify what the reasons were for that, what were the aspects that were not speaking to the male caregivers, and that allowed in the development to address those concerns and to develop activities or adjust activities so that they also speak to male caregivers and not only female caregivers. And then in subsequent practice runs and the pilot and full RCT, we saw really high retention of the male caregivers. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthony. Handing over to Yvonne from IRC.
Thanks. Thank you. So the IRC works in various humanitarian contexts across the world, and for today's session, I'll focus about our work in the Central African Republic. So in the Central African Republic, we work with displaced populations, and we do implement our work, we do implement the Families Make a Difference intervention, parenting intervention. This intervention was developed from evidence in 3 different countries, and then based on that, we have adapted it to be able to address the different needs of parents in conflicts or in humanitarian settings. I think the previous speakers have talked about the challenges that parents experience in humanitarian settings, the lack of resources or basic needs, looking at mental health and psychosocial support, and how these challenges do drive or affect parenting practices. So within the Families Make a Difference program, we have the core modules. We have 4 interventions actually. One is for caregivers of children 0 to 5. Another one is for caregivers of children 6 to 11, for adolescents, and also for adolescent parents. Within this intervention model, we have the core modules that we know are relevant across the different age groups. So we do have a session on brain development where we discuss with parents around child development. We do have the session on empathy and communication across the different curriculum, as well as positive interaction and discipline. And then for the different curricula for now tailored to the age group, then we do have specifics. So for caregivers of children 0 to 5, what is it that we want to discuss or to work with the parents for that specific age group? Same for 6 to 11 and also for caregivers of adolescents. I think one of the successes that we've seen across the different contexts where we are working on the Families Make a Difference is consistently there's reduction in harsh discipline and improvement in positive parenting strategies. So this is one of the ways that we do track implementation and how we do track implementation and to see what are we learning from the program. In terms of challenges, again, we are working in a humanitarian context. So Central African Republic is where we have conflicts causing displacement. So many times the program is disrupted because of security. When there's an security incident, the program has to stop. Parents are at risk, our staff are at risk. So such sporadic security concerns do affect the program. And this really brings to reality the challenges that the parents are facing constantly. That's within their community, this disruption, the safety and security, and how that further impacts parenting, their parenting and their relationship with the children. So I think in general, looking at our interventions, I think one of the things that I haven't highlighted in the slide, but it was brought out in Anthony's presentation, looking at mental health and psychosocial needs of parents, and how also parents can understand the psychosocial needs of their children. And this is something that is really important to consider in implementing parenting interventions in humanitarian contexts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Thanks, panelists. So the next question I'd like to pose to you all, and thank you for providing that context, is could you please share some key considerations? And Yvonne already touched on this in what she's just mentioned now, and I'm actually going to ask Yvonne to start us off in this section as well. Just a reminder also, could we just try and stick to 3 to 5 minutes in answering so that we get through everyone? Thank you.
Great. So linked to what I've just talked about is really important to remember that parents in humanitarian settings are living in a situation that isn't normal, right? So there is either conflict, there's displacement, and so it's really important to think about that parenting intervention within a protection program. That protection program does not have to be designed by the same organization, but it's really thinking around in that context where you're having the parenting intervention. Who is providing a protection program? What I mean by protection program is children are facing different forms of violence and abuse in the community, which is heightened in a humanitarian situation. So when parents are going through the parenting program, they do come up to the facilitators and ask, this is what is happening at home, this is what is happening in my community, how can I get help? And it can be really frustrating and disempowering to really work on positive parenting strategies, yet for violence, direct violence that the child is facing or the parent is facing, there's no service, there's nowhere where the parent can get help to support the child. So it's really important when designing parenting programs, thinking around holistically, what are the needs of the child, what are the needs of the parents, and how can we embed parenting programs within that protection program. Just quickly, I'll touch on the second aspect and leave the rest. The pre-conflict engagement. It's always important that we're thinking about sustainability of programs or interventions, not only in humanitarian settings, but in all settings. We do know that social welfare workforce is always constrained in normal settings, right? When there's no conflict, already we know that the social welfare workforce is constrained. In displacement and in humanitarian settings, it is further constrained. So it becomes really difficult to realize the reality of having the social welfare workforce take over or really lead the parenting intervention when they do not have practically the resources. So to address this, it's important to think about pre-conflict engagement of local government in designing and setting up these parenting interventions as a preparedness. So should there be humanitarian crisis or displacement, then already the work has been done rather than starting afresh when displacement occurs in terms of setting up and rolling out parenting interventions. I'll hand over to the other panelists to add to this.
Thank you. Ala, over to you.
Thank you. So one key consideration is flexibility in the delivery format of the resources. As I showed earlier in my last slide, having a range of resources of different intensities and formats is really important. And also matching these resources to the needs too is really important. So we shouldn't, for example, offer a trauma recovery intervention to families who've just experienced an earthquake. We should wait for a few weeks before intervening in this way. But on the other hand, we can very quickly begin to disseminate light touch resources like the leaflets, the videos, the booklets to the families in these really early stages of a humanitarian context. Another consideration would be really tapping into the value of disseminating parenting resources by piggybacking onto existing aid supply routes, particularly due to the lack of funds we often have in this context and the logistics. So let me share an example, as you can see from this picture. During the peak of the Syrian crisis in 2015, we wanted to disseminate a parenting information leaflet to caregivers who were still inside Syria, living in a conflict zone. And the only supplies that families were receiving at all was bread from a local bakery. So we partnered with the bakery and had them insert these parenting leaflets into the bread wrappers, really leading to a unique trial called the Bread Wrapper Study. And we disseminated 3,000 of these parenting leaflets in just 3 days. Really important information on how to care for your child. And also there was a feedback questionnaire and a pen also inserted. We had a remarkable response rate of almost 60% while engaging with families in a war zone. And this really highlights that even in conflict zones, families are really motivated and engaged and really want family skills information. And this example of piggybacking onto existing supply routes has been really effective in our experience in many humanitarian contexts and challenge settings. And we've done this by using supply routes for food parcels, water, sanitary products, bedding, as well as through many different messaging apps, printed forms, and also a child immunization app. So we're at the stage now where these evidence-informed tools are ready. And with every new emerging crisis since the Syrian conflict began, we have been able to very quickly make brief adaptations and additions to meet the new needs, informed by the field teams. And this was the case for the COVID-19 response to Ukraine, and more recently, the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. A final recommendation is that we need to ensure that we have engagement with local partners, but that this does not change the resources, that we don't lose the evidence base. We absolutely must work with local field teams and other gatekeepers in the areas we want to disseminate our resources. This will be to aid translation of the resources and to check that the relevant messages about any given specific humanitarian context are met. For example, information on child trafficking or how to keep your child safe during an earthquake. But we also need to check that the back translation of our messaging is also accurate. And by doing this, we also reduce the likelihood of us stigmatizing the resources to any particular intervention too. I'll hand over. Thanks.
Thanks, Ala. Over to Anthony, please.
Thanks. I'll keep this a bit short since I might be preaching to the choir here, but when we're talking about key considerations for humanitarian emergency context, mental health and psychosocial support are really, really crucial. And when talking about parenting specifically, we know that even in stable contexts, the exposure to prolonged adversity and stressors that lead to caregiver distress can, first of all, negatively influence parents' ability to act as nurturing caregivers to their children. But secondly, can also negatively influence child cognitive and psychosocial development and their overall well-being. So this is something that is kind of non-negotiable within this context. And obviously, when looking at when addressing child mental health and well-being within these contexts and looking at the socio-ecological model, the family and/or caregivers is a kind of very crucial layer at really addressing child mental health in these contexts. But kind of beyond that, also, when we're talking about parenting interventions, it's the caregiver well-being and mental health also takes a really important aspect, because in a lot of these interventions, we are trying to improve parenting skills and knowledge. But here again, the well-being of the receivers of these skills and knowledge, so the caregivers, is extremely important, because without mental health and well-being, the uptake of new skills and knowledge essentially becomes almost impossible when one is too stressed or distressed. And this is why, kind of going back quickly to the Be There intervention that I introduced, this is another reason why the caregiver well-being sessions or modules come first, and then the parenting skills and knowledge sessions only follow afterwards. And another thing that I wanted to highlight quickly is the importance of also kind of working intersectorially, and then also working together with government or other formal structures wherever it is possible. And also, I would like to highlight the amazing and important work that our colleagues at UNICEF and WHO have done with the MHPSS minimum service package, including Quiva, who presented earlier. So as mentioned, it doesn't only include activities around promoting caregiver mental health and psychosocial well-being and strengthening caregiver capacity to support children, and it also includes a lot of those key steps and considerations for implementing activities, these kinds of activities, but it also includes these steps for identifying key resources, working and coordinating intersectorially, and the different steps to do within that process, including when working with governments or with international NGOs, with local NGOs or community-based organizations, in addition to kind of establishing and or contributing to technical working groups within the field. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that also, the great work that they've done. And if you haven't taken a look at the minimum services package yet, I highly encourage you to do so. So yeah, handing back.
Thanks, Anthony. And finally, in this session, handing over to Khayyam.
Thank you very much. So one thing that we learned very quickly, and I'm going to bank on what Anthony just said, work with the government. But work with the government, but do not depend on it. It may sound a little counterproductive, but we know that the government has tremendous reach and infrastructure, yet the bureaucratic hurdles sometimes impede that work. And so, especially in humanitarian crisis, we need to be going really quickly. So the lesson is to supplement your intervention through the government's network, become the enabler to make the work go quicker. Also, at the village level, we collaborate with the local community and build a community-based organization, the CBOs. And we find that very often the CBO acts like a CEO of the village, the head of the CBO, so you can get a lot of work done very quickly. Thirdly, build partnerships with other NGOs who are specialists in that particular area. The kind of work that we are doing at Karachi Relief Trust is now not just the bricks and mortar, not just the buildings, but also we are going in what we call like a 360 concept. So there's the new village that's being rebuilt will also have schools nearby. They'll also have medical facilities. And then we're also looking at livelihood. So we can't do everything ourselves. So we build partnerships with NGOs. Also, I found that when we teamed up with the principals of government schools, in the area where we were piloting the parenting tips, we saw that they become cultural mediators, and we were able to enhance our effectiveness of coaching parents to support children. Specifically during last year's flood, another key consideration and learning has been safety and security. There are countless incidents of abuse and violence. So we build safe areas for children and women, primarily in such crises. I think I'll stop it now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hayam. And I think in closing the panel discussion, we wanted to just ask the panelists to reflect and share 2 priorities for the field going forward. This time I'm going to ask Anthony to start us off, please.
Thanks, Genevieve. So I will actually respond to this from a kind of research or academic perspective a bit more. So the first priority that I see for the research field anyway going forward is really looking at how do these interventions and approaches that we are using and that we have already shown to be effective through a very, very often rigorous process. We know that they achieve certain positive effects, certain improvements in these life quality indicators for the people that we work with. But one thing that we do need to understand better is how do they actually achieve these effects? And there's a couple of important reasons for that. One is that, and then moving already to the implementation science point, is that once we actually know the specific mechanisms of change, mechanisms how these interventions and approaches achieve the effects that they do, that really, really allows us to then look at what are the key ingredients and how of those interventions, and how do we translate those from, if we're looking at evidence-based interventions that can be very standardized, how can we translate those from a research realm, from a research perspective into practice, so that we can actually implement these effectively and at scale, which is where we really start to, when we're talking about these evidence-based interventions, where we really start to see the impact of these on larger numbers of people. And then once we also understand how they work, that also allows us to really ensure the quality of the care that we're providing when we are scaling up these numbers to reach more and more people that are in need. Thanks, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Yvonne, over to you.
I'll emphasize the difference that doing parenting work or supporting parents in humanitarian settings, what the difference is, and that is really about reducing the stresses that parents experience. So what makes the conflict setting or the humanitarian setting different from any other setting? I think it's really important that we prioritize and look at providing comprehensive services to support or to accompany the parenting interventions that we are implementing in this context. How can we really support the parent if there are other stresses that are bringing the parenting challenge that they're experiencing? The other priority, and I think I've seen that someone has put it in the chat, is in terms of reaching more parents. So the example I chose to share today about Central African Republic is in a context where we have to physically be present, provide the face-to-face support to parents in terms of implementation modality. But in some contexts, like in Lebanon, I think in Iraq as well, within the program, working with parents of children under 5, using different modalities, using different types of media to reach more parents has been a possibility. So I think it's really important that when we're thinking about reaching more parents, if your context can allow, it's safe, accessible, and you're not leaving the most in need parents behind, how can you use a different modality to reach more parents? And where it's not possible, how can you make sure that the safety considerations are enabling parents to safely access the intervention? Those are the 2 considerations I'll leave us with today.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Hayam, over to you.
Thank you. So couple of things that I feel have been the priorities going forward. Number 1 is scaling up. We've done, for example, prototyping in the upper Chitral area. Now the scaling strategy is through the formation of what I was referring earlier as the community-based organization. So they basically then take over and run the program, along with, integrating the community through other NGOs who are present in areas which are being affected in the certain disaster. So organizing community workshops and support groups to provide direct guidance to parents is one thing. The other aspect is to use design thinking approach. What we've seen is that urban minds here, at least in our country, view rural areas as a look down upon. And similarly, the villagers also themselves believe that they need crutches to solve their problems. So design thinking has the capability to promote a human-centered collaborative approach. And it's essential to involve parents in the design and development of intervention. So that's the aspect which I feel that we must not just take it as it comes, but involve the parents and open it up in a way that we understand the cultural nuances that there are. We also engage with other NGOs, like I was saying, like Charter for Compassion, the Go Read and all. So that's going to help build a better program in the future for us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Khayyam. And finally, Ala, to close us off in this session.
So we need to make use of this really wonderful protective shield that caregivers can be for their children through their early development and through adolescence, really recognizing the importance even more during challenging times. And we do this mainly by ensuring access to family skills resources. Caregivers we're finding are already motivated, they're already seeking help, we just need to give them access. My first priority would be to make sure that we're preparing concise, clear, short messages for donors or policymakers or funders, community gatekeepers. These messages to really highlight why investing in family skills interventions or resources is important. Messages like, for example, for every dollar spent on prevention activities, this would yield $10 in return. Whether we're academics or whether we're field workers or anyone else who's working in this field and is passionate, we need to recognize that we need to work better on how to engage others. And these messages really need to be ready and translated, not just for existing humanitarian context, but also in a way that we can respond straight away to emerging humanitarian contexts so that we can translate, edit, and begin disseminating. A second consideration would be that we know family skills programs can be delivered even when funds are really low and without extensive training of staff or high training in mental health. But as this field continues to grow wider, I'm always conscious that there's a need to make sure that resources remain light and that they have flexible approaches integrated into them to both the delivery and the training so that they can be used in the way that we want. And we certainly can't predict what's going to happen to these families that we're supporting at the many different stages of displacement or resettlement. Or any humanitarian context, but we absolutely have to remember we have a duty of care to provide them with all the possible physical, practical, and psychosocial services they might need, so that the tools that we develop must be practical. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to say thank you to our panelists, we do have some time for Q&A, and I know that some of the speakers have already been answering questions in the Q&A specifically, but I've pulled out a few questions that maybe I'll pose to the panel. The first one, how best can we use the information in cultural settings, as in some African countries, culture is still followed great, which leaves children and women to be vulnerable to various forms of abuse? Okay, so cultures obviously still plays quite a big role in a lot of African countries. And so what are some of your suggestions? And I'll open this up to the panel, so it can be a more general question. Is there anybody that would like to respond? Ala, you're still unmuted.
Yeah,
Would you like to take a go?
I'm happy to jump in to start. I think the first thing, we face this so much in our UNODC implementing in different countries. We come with our evidence-based tools, and in many countries, they will really say things like, how this might not work in our culture this works better. So it's really important to begin with that our tools begin by being translated in a really culturally appropriate way and are physically, visually acceptable to the families. And this is led by the field staff. So we need to make them, first of all, comfortable that this is coming for them specifically, not something being brought from somewhere else without any adaptation. A second thing is that when we receive such messages, it's really important that we have a very non-judgmental approach. And we're very respectful to the people that we're working with. And we tell them that the abuse that you're talking about that maybe is culturally normal may not be very useful in the short term or the long term. And there may be some really significant long-term effects of this. And much of the research shows the negative long-term effects. And then we tell them, just try these new tools, try these new skills. What do you have to lose? And it's often that kind of openness with the families we work with, where we just say, we understand what you're saying, but just try these and see what you think. Really, sometimes it helps to engage families.
Yvonne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add just to the idea of design. So I strongly believe, I do not have the evidence to quote, but I strongly believe that there's no culture that doesn't have anything positive. So when you're designing your program, work with the community, work with the parents in that context, the facilitators, the frontline staff. You'll have quite a number of good examples of positive elements or methodologies or even concepts that you can use to design your parenting program. That should reduce the resistance reaction when you're presenting an idea from something that has been transported from elsewhere and it just doesn't click. The parents don't get what you're saying and they feel like this is something being imposed. So look at the context, understand the social norms, understand what the drivers are, and that would help you design something that is context appropriate. And then listen to the facilitators. I think something that we learned about a program that then we did designed later, the parents will always be asking the facilitators, this doesn't work, or this is something we're struggling with. I think it's important that we do not also insist on what has been designed, it works. I think it's important to also pause and think, what are we hearing when we consistently get the feedback that something is not working or something is not passing well with the parents? What is that feedback telling us? Does it mean that it's not culturally appropriate? And how can we adapt it in a way that is context appropriate? I think that's where we get to win more than to get resistance reactions and people coming to sessions because they have to come rather than because they really feel this is important to them.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm going to ask two specific questions. Firstly, to Anthony. There was a question that popped up, and I'm not sure if you've answered this one because I know you actually answered something already in the chat. So it was the one that they were interested to learn more about the Be There program. Is it available online was the question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I also answered it in the chat, but happy to give a quick overview also of that. So it is, we're currently in the scaling process for that. And I am happy to, I put it on the chat, but I'm not sure if everyone is able to see it. The website for it on the wordchildholland.org website, which outlines a lot more details on the intervention and also a bit of its background. But also if there are any questions, additional questions to me, then feel free to reach out also to me directly by email. I think the organizers have my email somewhere on file.
Thanks so much, Anthony. And then finally, Chaim, there was a question to you around the Karachi organization, and someone wanted to know, could you volunteer despite living in a different country?
Yes, definitely you can. We've had volunteers from as far away as Argentina and Turkey. So there is, so Karachi Relief Trust actually gets together whenever there's a disaster. And lately, of course, we've had this a series of disasters with the super flood that will take 2 to 3 years for Pakistan to rebuild. So we do need volunteers. I would say go to our Facebook page or to our website or take my email address from the organizers and drop me an email. And yes, most certainly we need a lot of help. Just let us know what kind of volunteering you can do.
Thank you so much. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists once again for your insights as well as your contributions to your respective fields, and also for providing your contact details. And I know that has been made available, but it will also be made available on the GPI website where you would go to webinars, and I know that the information would be there as well. Finally, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca Smith from Save the Children to do our closing.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you just go to the next slide? So I know that there's been a lot of really interesting discussions about community-based approaches, looking at some of our contextualization, thinking about norms in a community and how to respond. I just wanted to say briefly about our program called Safe Families, which Save the Children has implemented in 40 countries since 2017. And we've recently conducted an evidence synthesis and review of our work so far. Many of these are humanitarian context, and I just wanted to remind people, which I know you know already, that not all humanitarian contexts are the same. And so when we were thinking about, when is it appropriate and how to implement parenting programs in humanitarian context, we're thinking about after the sudden onset, when there is some sufficiently stable and basic needs of parents are met. And one of the components that we do struggle with in humanitarian context is because so much of elements of this program is in really thinking through deep and long-lasting behavior change, which can be, much more challenging in a humanitarian setting, especially if there's a lot of migration and displacement. However, we know that, in a more stable humanitarian context, like a refugee camp or in a place where people are still in that population for a long period of time, more of that behavior change and long-term sort of social norms work can happen. So one of the things that we considered, especially for migrating and displaced families that are often in transit, we're thinking about if you have to reduce the length of your sessions. So right now we offer 10 parent sessions and 9 children's sessions that happen concurrently. So what happens if parents are coming through a transit center or moving on to someplace else and they can't complete the whole program? What exactly could they benefit from, but what also is outside of the scope of the program? And so we're thinking if you have to reduce the length of time, you're really looking more at that. What can I give? What is the immediate knowledge that they need? But also, how do we help to reduce their stress and give them a bit more capacity going forward? But then making sure that our measurement tools also reflect that, so that we're not doing a lot of trying to do pre and post tests on behavior change that we haven't actually we don't believe will change in the same way. So that's just something to consider when looking at your monitoring and evaluation, is how much time do you have with that family in a humanitarian context, and what are you trying to achieve? Recognizing that the more time you have with a family, there might be more that you can change. The other element that I don't think a lot of other parenting programs have addressed is the importance that we see in really engaging children in these sessions and improving the relationship of children communicating with their parents. We found that parents on the move could really benefit from additional sessions, specifically on understanding the new context and location in which they're in and how to access those services, really focusing much more on mental health and psychosocial support, recognizing significant grief and loss that children and their parents have gone through, and making sure that the staff are trained in psychological first aid, identification, and referral. So the guidance that we've put out is really thinking through the referral pathways that need to be in place while you're supporting a parenting program, how you build on existing information already, whether or not that's a child protection assessment, secondary information, or gender analysis, so that your programs are based on the context to the best of your ability, and that you're really thinking about risk mitigation. We believe there needs to be more specific adaptations in parenting programs when you're thinking about children who are being cared for in kinship and foster families, also children who are being returned to their families if they've been separated or unaccompanied, and how to support children who've been reintegrated after being recruited into armed forces and groups. We think that those are additional elements that could be based on a parenting program, but would also need additional significant support. So those are some of the key elements that I've spoken about, and the things that we are thinking about in humanitarian context. Also, just to remind people that even though it is a fast-changing environment in a humanitarian context, measurement is still equally important. And so how do we make sure that we can continue to learn from humanitarian context? If you can just go to the next slide. Just really to think through, how do we learn from each other and benefit from each other? There is the Family Strengthening Task Force, which is co-led by Sarah Hummel from Save the Children, Sabine in the World Health Organization, and also Marian from War Child Netherlands, and we can put her name in the chat box as well. If you'd like to know more about the work of the Family Strengthening Task Force, go to the task force website. And also, I just want to thank all the panelists today. It's been so interesting to see all of the different contexts that we work in, how we work together. You can see the email addresses of all of the different panelists. They would love to get to know, what's happening, keep the conversation going. And there are also, to get more in touch, you can also go to the Global Initiative to Support Parents website and the Global Parenting Initiative. I think this is all about us learning together, building the evidence base, and recognizing the specific context in which we're working, and also what are the limitations of different types of interventions. So if we're doing one thing, what is it that we're expecting to see in response? And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And I really hope you the best of luck in working on supporting parents in humanitarian settings. Thank you.